Okay, good morning, everyone. It's just about 10 o'clock now, Jamaica time, and that would be 11 o'clock in the Bahamas and in Trinidad. And I trying to see where else we have our participants from, but certainly in the Eastern Caribbean. So I want to welcome you all to what I guess is the last meeting of Catalp'S for the 2021-2022 academic year. We have had some events over the year. We met up twice on the occasion of the Day of the Imprisoned Writer in November. And also we met up in March to celebrate International Writers' Day. And so we're happy that in fact we had good attendance and we had really engaging discussions around those days. And for those occasions, the event was really open to the general public as well as to ourselves as academic literacy practitioners. But today's meeting is a little bit more, I guess, intimate, more, I don't want to say insular, but certainly it's about us more than about our publics in terms of the students and the general public. And so I want to welcome you. I hope that we'll have many more people joining us. I am Carolyn Dyche, and I'm a member of the executive, and Clover Jones-McKenzie, another member of the executive, is also here. And I think so is Raymond, and we will be joined, I'm sure, by some other members shortly. I'm going to ask you we didn't ask anybody to register for the event. So I'm going to ask you just to put your name in the chat for me, please, and also your institutional affiliation, just so that we have a record of those who attended. And if I don't remember at other times during our meeting, can you just prompt me for those who come late, someone on the exec, to ask people just to put in their names and institutional affiliations. Okay, so welcome everyone. I know it's the end of a long academic year and people are tired. And so last year at this time, we actually had a forum, colloquium we called it, where we had 4 presentations from the landmark and the prize-winning work Caribbean Creole composition. And so we listened to the authors of those chapters in the book, and we discussed and interacted around those presentations. And it was followed by a short annual general meeting of the association. Today's link up, what we're calling a roundtable, is really not as heavy, you'll be glad to know, because we are really turning the spotlight on ourselves. And we're looking at a theme that usually we engage with in relationship to our courses and our students themselves, with student identities in mind. So some of our courses are themed around language and identity, that are grounded in language and identity in some way, if not fully centered around. Some are not, but some are. And historically, in a lot of the our institutions, certainly coming from the 70s, when the linguists had a very strong role in our courses, there was actually a lot of advocacy for language and identity to enter into our space, where we were looking at the use of English, what we're now calling academic literacies. So that was, you consider components in those courses. What we thought that we should do today in turning the focus inward as opposed to outward, so looking at ourselves, it was really with the idea of kind of getting to know each other more, to kind of share our lived experiences in terms of language and identity. And I know that can be very personal. So there may be, of course, incidents and experiences that persons don't want to share. But we felt that there would probably be some that individuals felt comfortable sharing, to kind of reflect on who they are in terms of as human beings, but eventually also as professionals, as academic literacy professionals. And so really, I think the aim is really for there to be introspection on our part, maybe some self-enlightenment, if it is something that people haven't really thought about too much, but perhaps more importantly, for there to be understanding in terms of the different lenses that we all have, the different backgrounds that we have, where we come from. And I guess that's important for a community like ours that we hope will gel together at some point, but which we know will have individuals and will represent areas that are vastly different in terms of language and identity, because the Caribbean is far-flung. And of course, we know, even when we speak about the Anglophone Caribbean, or I like the term I'm hearing now, the English official Caribbean, okay, what I used to call the Commonwealth Caribbean, we know that there are various languages, there are various persons are at different stages, and nations are at different stages when it comes to advocacy to do with Creole languages, to do with, you know, the role of Creole languages as opposed to official languages, etc. So the idea really is to share our stories in a very open way, not really to be engaging so much in debate about whether our courses should have a strong role with language and identity or not, even though some people might want to touch on that, but that we would really be kind of getting to know our backgrounds and some of the influences that would now be shaping us as we develop courses and as we, in our pedagogy, in our practice, and as we interact with students, and as we react to some of the portrayal of what we do in scholarship, in research and scholarship. So that's my opening remarks in a sense. What I wanted to, what we had decided to do was to try to get the ball rolling so that we wouldn't have too many, you know, long pauses between persons coming to, you know, share their stories, by asking a few individuals to start us off. And so really thankful to have gotten a positive response from Dominic, from Rhoda, from Mark, and from Andrew. I'll ask them to introduce themselves as they come up. And yeah, it's really a free-flowing kind of session. So I think everybody should relax. We should have told you to bring some wine, perhaps. It's early in the morning for wine, but you know, for it to be right, just sharing, as I said, storytelling, which we know we are good at, coming from our oral tradition and our oral culture. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dominic. And Raymond, I know you said that you have something to share. So I think he needs to share, Dominic will need some sharing of the screen. So let me, yeah, turn it over to Dominic. If you can introduce yourself, Dominic, and then just take over from there. And what I would do is say, I'd ask Dominic to be followed by Rhoda, and then by Mark, and then by Andrew, and then we'll open it up. Okay.
There you go. You can hear me now.
Yes, I can hearing you loud and clear.
Wonderful.
Is Raymond all set up with what you need? I think he can, we have given him the, he can share us the screen, so.
Okay, no problem. I'll alert him when to share the video clips. But good morning, I'm Dr. Dominic Roll, and I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of the Bahamas, and delighted for the opportunity to share in this roundtable, which focuses on language and identity. And my presentation is entitled, Eyes Man, Embattled Black Masculinities in the English Classroom. So the noted Bahamian scholar Ian Strawn created an engaging documentary called Eyes Man, Manhood in the Bahamas, which explores diverse issues centered on Black manhood in a Caribbean nation where Black masculinity is embattled. Produced in 2016, this documentary has frequently been used as a pedagogical tool in classrooms at UB and beyond. For instance, I often use it as a pedagogical tool for the cultural component essay in my English 1302, ENGL 1302 course, which is the second iteration of CONC at UB. This documentary highlights the destructive patriarchal practices and viewpoints of which many Black Bahamian men possess. And these viewpoints often lead to societal blights. Contributing to our discussion on language and identity, I offered that this popular Bahamian expression used by men, that is, I's man, often ingrains narrow conceptualizations of toxic Black masculinity, while it serves as what J.L. Austin deems as a performative utterance, a sentence which not only describes a given reality, but also changes the social reality it is describing. And in this particular sense, often changes the social reality in a negative way. So from this standpoint, I wish to begin a dialogue about how Black Bahamian undergraduate students at UB internalize this expression too often as a vexed mode through which they then engage the learning communities in humanities courses and in English courses in particular. While their typically negative attitudes towards participating in English and humanities courses are often grounded in the notion of these subjects as soft and characterized by effeminacy, I would like to begin a dialogue about how we as educators can challenge Black male university students in the Caribbean and in the Bahamas specifically to eschew and defy patriarchal, narrow conceptions of Black masculinity, which limit their full participation in humanities courses. This diminishes their educational growth and civic participation as engaged citizens who can help challenge the marginalization of women and other oppressed groups while serving as caretakers in their families and society. Now let us turn to a more in-depth description of I's man, manhood in the Bahamas. So as noted by Ian Strawn, since in the description of his film, since the start of the global recession, the Bahamas has been gripped by a crime wave. Brutal acts of murder and rape have shocked and dismayed many. The violent crimes being committed in the country are almost exclusively the actions of males under the age of 36. There is no simple solution to crime in any society, nor is there a single cause for criminal behavior. However, it is widely believed that the absence of a positive father figure in the home and of male role models generally contributes to male dysfunction. In the Bahamas, where most children are born out of wedlock and most live with just one parent, I'm a product of a single family home as well by a powerful mother, a hardworking woman. These factors are crucial. This documentary explores the issue of manhood in a Caribbean nation at a crossroads. It delves deeply into the dynamics of Bahamian family relations that contribute to male absenteeism in the home and the degree to which violent behavior in males can be linked to the Bahamian notion of masculinity and to the roles males play or fail to play in the lives of their sons, brothers, wives, sisters, and friends. The documentary discusses marital rape, LGBTQIA issues, machismo, crime, race, class, patriarchy, urbanization, and media, all discussed through engaging interviews. And as noted earlier, I often use this film as one potential primary source which students can use as the basis for completing their cultural component essays. While the general criteria for this assignment is standardized as a part of the English department's ENGL 1302 course design, the instructors have significant leeway in personalizing this assignment to meet the learning objectives for the course. Bearing on the theme of the roundtable, the cultural component positions undergraduates to choose a Bahamian culture artifact, a play, documentary, or site visit to the Bahamas National Art Gallery or cultural heritage site, or a cultural heritage site, and to describe their encounter with it while reading or interpreting the cultural artifact as a text. I often select this documentary as an option for this assignment because I endeavor to challenge undergraduates of primarily African descent to recognize their destructive investments in patriarchal notions of Black manhood, which characterize their self-perceptions as dominant, immovable, and self-contained, all inferred by the expression I's man. So that being the case, Raymond, would you kindly share with us a clip from the documentary I's Man? You can start at 1 minute and 30 seconds. You can forward it to 1 minute, 30 seconds. It should be actually right there. That's perfect place to start where Zhivargo Lang.
Continue to see him true.
We have some people in this country, in particular young Black males, whose egos have swollen to the point of destruction. They identify so totally and completely with an image that has been created of them. This boy don't play. Him, he don't play. So he and don't and play are him. They are one. So anything that challenges he don't play, bump, lack of respect. Now, his ego is so vehemently opposed to that offense that getting rid of the offense by way of murder is not a challenge.
Thank you so much. So, as the former Minister of Education, Zhivargo Lang, notes, young men identify with a destructive image of them connoted by the expression, I's man. This boy don't play. Him don't play. Him and boy and play are interwoven in the identities of Black Bahamian men and young Black Bahamian men in particular, to such an extent that any affront to their masculinity, that is, which they consider as challenging their status, as immovable, as dominant, as all-powerful, that could be a bump. That can be anything they conceive of as a lack of respect, anything that challenges their ego and sense of a feeling of authority, right? Becomes represented by and empowers violence, right? Being a lamentable result. So I'm intrigued by the prospects of how we as educators can recuperate the power of this expression, I's man, to enlighten men, right, in our humanities courses and in society more generally, right, by galvanizing the expression, I is man, for powerful and productive ends. So I suggest that men's endorsement of this self-referential declaration negatively alters the social reality by further ingraining in society webs of blight, which lead to violence against women, LGBTIA groups, violence against women and LGBTIA groups, Bahamian men's reticence to be vulnerable and to show affection and to take care of their partners and children, and ironically, a defiance against studying the arts and letters, because investing in soft subjects can position them as effeminate as they see it. In my courses, many male students who often have intriguing insights concerning the text that we are discussing seem to hide behind the veil of anonymity, oftentimes turning off the camera, oftentimes trying to pretend that they're not interested and disconnected in order to seem cool, in order to reinforce a sense of dominant masculinity in the classroom. And so I want us to think more about how we can encourage them to open up, to show that their efforts to support a healthy classroom environment and to be and to galvanize the intelligence that they have and present it in our classrooms, right, is a notable effort and part of self-growth and community transformation. I want to challenge the stigmatization of Black men and men in general studying the humanities as soft, right? And in many ways, reposition it as a means to impart societal good and lead to greater productivity in our society. So humanistic inquiry can serve as an important gateway through which male undergrads can gain self-efficacy, a more healthy understanding of using their status as Black men, as co-creators of culture and participants in reinforcing a broader vision for how language itself bears reciprocal relationships to thought, beliefs, and actions. Many students in my class, and many male students in my class sometimes hide behind the camera, try to avoid appearing intelligent or to appear invested in the humanities. But there are students who do stand up and speak out and support a healthy learning environment. And male students in particular as the focus of this presentation. And so I also want to reinforce that we have students and Black male students who are brave enough to present their voices and viewpoints in the classroom. And so my hope overall is to create a more student-centered teaching environment where all of my students recognize how the nexus of language and identity reinforce interlocking oppressions, intersectionality, and potentially the prospects of self and community transformation. And one of the ways in which I do this through assignments is by utilizing spoken word. I challenge undergraduates to produce spoken word poetry, which engages a course reading and critical issues in the pandemic. And to demonstrate that, Raymond, can you play the second clip? This is by a student named Jamara Thompson, who presents his spoken word poetry. You can start from the beginning and we'll stop at about 2 minutes.
Hello, my name is Jamara Thompson. I am in Dr. Dominic Rowe's English 120 class, section 6. The inspiration for this spoken word comes from the essay written in the Writer's Guide 2 by Dr. Rhoda Arundel, entitled Mask, Passes, and Privilege, Response to a Pandemic. This essay by her takes a unique perspective as Dr. Arundel does not just dive directly into the pandemic, but instead gives us an historical perspective on slavery. She then connects vestiges of slavery to the restrictions put in place in various countries, including our homeland. I found this essay especially captivating as she tells the story of the ugly truth of racism that bore its head during the pandemic. A portion of my spoken word captures some of the anger of the people in her essay and some of the privileged racist utterings. I decided to add many of the things I've heard on the news and from family and friends. I ended by giving my view on the pandemic. I trust you enjoy. Here goes. Pandemic lamentations. Every single day you cry about something. Masks, curfews, lockdowns. Why are they imposing on us, you ask? You yell at the top of your voice with words and phrases like, we demand justice. Our freedoms are being denied. My constitutional rights are being infringed upon. Screaming at everyone and demanding they stay woke, claiming that you're woke. Woke? Yeah, woke, all right. Because many did not wake up yesterday, did not wake up today, and many will not wake tomorrow. You compare this pandemic brought on by a virus to slavery, making a mockery of the more than 200 years of Black enslavement, as if slaves, stolen from their country, brought to stolen lands, to work on stolen land for another's family was just a mere inconvenience. You trivialize the dehumanization of an entire race of people, people who were chained, raped, and beaten, men and women who were made to work for free and treated worse than animals. You try to equate masks meant to protect.
Thank you. Just want to show you some of the positive work that some of our Black male students are doing and imparting in the English classroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dominic, for that stimulating and intriguing presentation. Coming from an angle that I think many of us wouldn't even have thought of in terms of language and identity. Opening the floor for any questions for Dominic, or any feedback of any sort, comments on his presentation on the link between the use of particular terms and male identity, and how that feeds into what he does in his courses to take a position against what he sees as masculine toxicity and you know, kind of alpha male behavior that has such a negative impact on the society. I think here in Jamaica and in a lot of other Caribbean countries, we can relate to the issue of violence in a very real way in terms of the how significant it is, what a force it is, and how it negatively impacts our societies. So if you want to raise your hand, I will ask, call on person want to give any kind of feedback to Dominic in terms of his take on himself in the classroom. Jesse, can I ask you to mute? Yes, we have a question, or we have someone raising their hand. That's Tarika. Go ahead, Tarika.
All right, good morning, everyone. I just found it very interesting, similarities. Jesse, can you hear us?
Hold on, let me try and see if I can mute. If I can, hold on. I'm gonna try and see if I can mute the impact. All right, hold on. Yeah, let me mute. Okay, yes, go ahead now, Tarika.
Right, I found it so interesting in terms of, you know, the similarities to what we've experienced here in Jamaica. This whole idea of, I've had students, for example, comment that, you know, it's not that I dislike English, but where I'm from, English is for girls. You know, it's perceived as something that's, you know, for women, and they should not go very deeply into understanding or using it. And of course, attached to other things, as you know, they don't want to be labeled as gay if they're engaging in the use of English and all those kinds of things. And so you see it in the language and the response they tend to have to the kinds of courses that we do. So I found it very interesting, as I said, you know, probably the shared history, as was mentioned earlier, in terms of what would have led our men to come to this kind of conclusion. And so in our courses, therefore, I think it's so important that we have to begin with how we introduce their native languages, their mother tongue to them, and changing perceptions of what we are really and truly trying to accomplish in terms of, we're not saying to do away with one, you know, and stick to the other. It's knowing how to effectively function in both as we move along, and understanding that, you know, if we want to it's not negating Creole or whatever other language you might use, but understanding that we still need to be able to function, especially globally, in both our languages and perceive them both positively. So I found that very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that feedback.
Thank you. It's interesting in terms of what Terika just said, that the terms that you use, eyes man, he don't play, this boy don't play. I guess that would be Bahamian Creole, or is that, where is that on the kind of continuum? Right.
That is dialect, classic Bahamian dialect.
This is home language, this is heart language. And, yes. And so it expresses, you know, these very powerful inner emotions, I assume, yes, that play out negatively now on the social scene and now in the academic sphere. So my comment is, as we engage with students in terms of their parlance, their day-to-day language, you know, in our courses, oftentimes people say, well, what's the topics? What are your what is your focus? You don't really have any content, but the content in terms of academic literacies can be anything, and it can very much be our social realities in terms of things like, as you say, violence, the male, male and female issues, masculinity, etc. So what I found intriguing was how you centered, I'm assuming that you centered the course around those kind of themes.
Yeah.
And then dealt with developing, so you're getting consciousness and transformation, as well as developing of written and, reading and writing and information literacy, etc. Kind of all.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things too that I think about more broadly in relationship to my role as an educator, I teach in English. At some point, I'll be teaching business courses as well, because I have a degree in business as well. But I'm interested too in the possibilities of encouraging all of my students, and male students in particular, to recognize that the skill sets that they gain in English are beneficial to their development as thought leaders and as business leaders, right? And so I think that it's important to reinforce that interdisciplinarity, that strong writing and speaking skills, right, can literally put money in the bank, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's something to be said too when we speak to students in a language that they understand, because sometimes they feel as if, some of the things we talk about in English are too ethereal, right? And that language, is just it's soft and should just be functional in a day-to-day environment. That vernacular is fine. That I've always spoken this way. Why should I change? But especially when they're in university, we can get them to realize that you will be paid, you can be productive, you can be a leader, you can be a stronger critical thinker, and that has value. That has value in the bank, but has value in society more broadly. And I think we can make some strides in getting them to realize how important it is, understand the interrelationship between language, culture, and identity.
Thank you. I see Rhoda had up her hand, so just going to go ahead, Rhoda.
What I found interesting, oh my goodness, I've lost his name now. It was there on the screen. What I found interesting about the presentation is the specific way in which speaking standard English or having a facility with standard English is viewed as being not masculine. But in Caribbean society, having a facility with language, knowing how to give talk, knowing how to throw talk, that is seen as strength. It is valorized in manhood and masculinity. And we see it throughout the region in our griot tradition, right? Whether it is dance hall, being able to spit lyrics, whether it is calypso, or, just basically just hanging out on the street corner and being able to throw talk for people. So we make a clear distinction between a facility with standard English and the ability to use language well. So in our minds, using the Creole well is an act, is a sign of masculinity, but using standard English well is seen to be effeminate. And I know I'm wondering, when did we decide that a facility with the English, with standard English, a facility with standard English was a feminine trait versus a masculine trait, right? Because if you're going back in the colonial period, one of the signs of male strength, certainly from a white colonial perspective, would be a facility with language, with the written language as well as the spoken language. The language of power is standard English. So when did standard English, when did that push back against standard English and the sense of fighting back at it and denaturing it, removing its power by making it an effeminate thing? When did that happen? And how was that a choice made? Because to me, that's one of the things there, that whole idea of pushing back at the language, and the way to push back at the language is to say, well, this ain't masculine. This has to be, this has to be feminine.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
that's my 2 cents there.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you, Rhoda. I see Ingrid has up her hand, so I'm just gonna move on right to her. Yes, Ingrid.
Yes. Can you hear me, Caroline?
Yes, but you're a little low, but speak up.
All right. Very interesting comment by Rhoda, and it's something that I have battled with over a period of time. I've done some reading on the situation, and I think partially it is an attempt by the enslaved. It is historically related, I think, where, speaking the language of the slave master meant, as if you were being supporting the language, etc. So it was an attempt to have our own language, and a kind of pushback to the whole, mastery, the slave mastery, and our quote unquote lowly position in relation to that. I think, having our own language was a way of being quote unquote independent. And I'm not saying that, that covers everything, but I think that we have to look at our history, our background, where we are coming from, and look at the development of the Creole itself to see that, it was something that we needed to have for ourselves.
Ingrid, I grasp all of that. I get all of that. I guess let me try and make better sense of what I was trying to say. For my entire life, 40 something years, language and being able to use language and having a facility with language was seen as a strength, but in certain classes, right? So if you were part of a higher socioeconomic in a bracket, for instance, having a facility with language and being able to use language was valorized, and it was also seen as a site of power, as a space of power. And when you're talking to people from lower socioeconomic brackets, they also talk about people who have a facility with language as being better, more powerful, in certain ways. So I was just intrigued by the fact that we would be teaching young men at the tertiary level, and the tertiary level is a space that you associate with persons from particular socioeconomic groups, and in those socioeconomic groups, they're looking at standard English as being effeminate, as opposed to a strength or a facility or a positive thing. And I'm not saying that I don't understand where the pushback comes from. I thoroughly understand where the pushback comes from in terms of the power plays and the politics surrounding language. I just thought it was intriguing that the use of standard English was an effeminate thing, but generally we see having a facility with language, being able to use language, especially for sparring purposes, verbal sparring purposes, we see that as a strength, but we see proficiency in English, standard English, as effeminate. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you, Rhoda. I'm going to allow Charlene and then Andrew to weigh in, and then we're going to move on to another speaker. This is, very we hopefully will get back to it when we open up back, yes, to our kind of plenary. Charlene?
Yes, I'm not going to go on for long. I just wanted to suggest that the silencing that happens to the Creole voice when English is privileged is probably connected to the assertion of the I man personality. And it may also be connected to crime, because when you silence a person in their own society, certain dysfunctional things have to happen. And we live it, and thank you for that absolutely excellent presentation. And we live what you have said can apply to, I think, every single Caribbean nation at this time. Possibly, I want to say possibly with the exception of Haiti, because they have their own kind of assertiveness that is different from ours, because they were the only truly independent, emancipated nation. But I leave it right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlene. Andrew?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to jump in on that question and the point that Rhoda raised, because I actually had a different take on why it's happening. Because the question of the of English or standard English being perceived as effeminate, I don't think it's just a Caribbean contextual thing. Like I've observed this, like I spend way too much time online, but I've observed a lot of online spaces, like for example, on Twitter, with like American people of a range of races. And what I think is actually I shouldn't say more or less, because what you have raised is actually quite, I think, significant. But I think another dynamic is this kind of post-ironic idea of trying too hard being seen as a weakness. So like what's one of the most common insults recently? Oh, you're trying too hard at this thing. Oh, you're not relaxed, not organic, you're trying too hard. So there's this perception that being proficient in English requires too many rules. So like, for example, it's this kind of anti-intellectualism that I've seen in online spaces a lot across the world. So for example, somebody's having an argument and or not even an argument, they make a point and somebody corrects something that they say, like structurally or even content-wise. And the person who's corrected responds by saying, oh, it's not that deep. Why are you taking it that seriously? So there's this perception that English as a language is a language that cannot be played around with. It has its prescriptive structures and there is no room for maneuvering. And there is a perception that non-English communication, especially our Creole languages in the Caribbean, can be played around with. And I think it ends up actually being harmful because both English and Creolese can be played around with. But there becomes this understanding that, oh, English is sacrosanct, or I think like you were saying, ethereal. So you can't do anything with it. So if I have to become good at that, it would require some amount of vulnerability for me to learn how it works. But the flip side is that it ends up harming the Creole languages too, because then people come to the Creole languages with like, they don't have rules in Creole languages. You can do whatever you want to do. So rather than, for example, the way we might think of like somebody like Shakespeare who played around with English and did his own thing anyways, people don't have that perception of English. They have it of the Creole languages. And I think it ends up harming both sides because you don't see the language as just a tool for expression. You see one as something you can't touch. And so as a rejection of that perception of it being rigid, you're like, oh, that's for girls, that's not for me. I can do what I want to do. I can do my own thing with this other language. But that language is, that if I try too hard or care too much about it, then it becomes this kind of effeminacy. Because that's really my additional take on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much, everyone, for weighing in as you have. I'm going to ask Dominic if you can just put in the chat the name of the documentary, because I think it's something that we may many of us would want to explore in terms of our own having it as a resource, looking across the Caribbean at similarities there. And I think the discussion and the feedback really brings to my attention the importance of us having these discussions with our students. When they come in, oftentimes we just want to get them geared to these are the objectives of the course, but to kind of really probe in terms of their attitudes to some of these issues that have a language link in some way, and to get them talking about their different linguistic identities, their Creole identities, their standard identities, and their attitudes to them, in terms of, as you said, whether one is a sissy language in Jamaica. There was an article some years ago, and a lot of the males were saying they saw it as a sissy language, a girl language, and this is what, and as opposed to their real identity, and that real identity was best conveyed using their Creole languages. So these conversations really, perhaps as we engage them in writing, should be the focus of the writing and not necessarily some kind of abstract topic, That's something we can think about. Yeah, thank you very much, Dominic, for the presentation, excellent presentation, and for what it has generated in terms of feedback. Okay, I'm gonna go over to Rhoda, who's our only female of the four people that we asked to just get the ball rolling. And as I said, we didn't give anybody any kind of restrictions or any kind of structure for their sharing. So, we're just there for the person to share as they have a mind. So over to you, Rhoda.
Thank you. Dominic, before I move into talking about what I want to talk about, I just wanted to say this. The other thing that struck me about your presentation this morning is that Earl Lovelace, I don't know if you know that Trinidadian writer, right? Earl Lovelace uses that particular dichotomy a lot in his books, because in The Schoolmaster, in, oh my goodness, Wine of Astonishment, and in Dragon Can't Dance, Salt, and even It's Just a Movie, there are two sets of male characters, right? There's that dichotomy. There's the teacher, right? Or the politician who has this facility with language, as in standard English language or acceptable language. And that person is always positioned as a smart man, somebody who is going to hoodwink the population. And so the population can't trust them as a result of their facility with language. And then you have the other type of male character who is from, working class, rougher and more aggressive in terms of his language. So it might be very interesting to work in some of those things in a further paper. I find what you're doing there really quite fascinating, very interested. So let me just go into, I'm not doing anything that is anywhere near as polished as what you would have done, Dominic. I'm just going to talk about my experiences. And I'm starting from, I guess, like, autoethnography in the sense that I come from Trinidad and Tobago, 2 islands, 1 republic. One parent is Tobagonian, one parent is Trinidadian, and one parent is of African descent. The other parent is of East Indian descent. And what I've noticed about language, having been teaching language in the academic literacies program here, teaching students how to write more than I'm teaching them how to speak per se. But in teaching them how to write, you begin to realize that language is a space that can either make students feel included or make students feel excluded. And based on how included or how excluded they feel, there is a range that they're on in terms of their confidence when they come into a classroom. So you will have students that are very intelligent, very bright, scored very well on their other various subjects, their degree option subjects when they come into the writing program. But when they come to the specific foundation writing courses, there is a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation, and a lot of, well, miss, my English not so good, And in the early weeks of the course, I spend a lot of time when I'm doing the lectures. Each lecture, I try to have a couple slides in there where we repeatedly talking about the Creole as an acceptable form of communication and standard as another acceptable form of communication, and the fact that there are that students come with different degrees of facility in the various languages, and the various languages are useful for various spheres. So Bridgerton, the television series, well, the Netflix series, was very useful for me during the time of the pandemic, because it allowed me to get them to look at or to think about very formal hybrid types of language. So language as more on the acrolectal end of the continuum. And the interesting thing is, when you ask these students to speak for you in what they think of as very standard English, they invariably use King James, the King James Version Bible type English, right? That's what they will give you. So if you say to them, take this sentence. So let's say I say to them, for breakfast this morning, I had eggs and zabuka, right? And you give them the sentence, and you give them the sentence in, I would say, mesolectal Creole or mesolectal English, which is like a little bit of Creole, a little bit of English inside there. You give them the sentence and you tell them, make this very formal. And in their minds, very formal is considered to be Shakespearean language or the King James Version Bible language. And it tells you the impact that religion in the home, the movies that folks would have seen as children, and what you're told is classic English or classic language or classic literature, how those things impact on what we think language is. Now, part of why I talked about my parents, their background and my background is that Trinidad does not have one Creole and Trinidad does not have a standard, and you can't say there's a standard Creole either. The East Indian population would have come with their own language systems, more than one language system that would have impacted on whatever was the standard language they met when they arrived here. And so they would have arrived here and the British were already in charge, but the French language and French Creole was very much the lingua franca of the day. And you had Urdu and Bhojpuri tying up inside there. It also meant that when we switched over to English eventually, when as an entire society, we switched over to using English and English being the standard language, whether it was standard English or English Creole being what everybody was speaking, the common language for everybody, you still had all of that interference from other language systems in there. And as a result of that interference from other language systems, from North Trinidad to South Trinidad, you have different pockets of Creole. And as a result of the different pockets of Creole, they're different. When you're sitting in a classroom and you're talking to children about the Creole that they're speaking, you can't assume that there is a standard Creole. So if I was to say to some students, that cup belongs to me. Sorry, if I say that cup belongs to me, and I ask students from, I would say, more the Afro-descended group to change that into Creole, it would be a different translation than if I ask somebody from somebody of Indian descent from Central Trinidad or from South Trinidad to turn that standard English statement into a Creole statement. And I think that's one of the interesting challenges we face, certainly I face and others like myself would face in a classroom situation when you're doing foundation English, because while we know, or while we have arrived at what is standard English, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, we don't have a standard Creole. And then you get over to Tobago, and Tobago has an entirely different language situation going on in terms of its Creole as well. And so it means that you sit in classrooms and you actually have to let the students tell you where they think they are in terms of the Creole continuum. And that always makes for an interesting conversation, because many of these students come in and they've never really stopped to think about what is Creole, what is their Creole, what influences their Creole, what are the situations in which they are speaking Creole, because many of them think they're speaking formal English on a regular basis until you indicate, oh no, that's not formal English. I'm not even teaching the class in formal English. I'm teaching the class in, yes, I'm teaching the class in a version of Creole that I feel will be able to reach everybody in the room. And then while I'm using that version of Creole to teach the students, I am using a version of Creole to teach them how to employ standard English. And that's one of the things that we're always discussing in the classroom. I say to them, I've just told you in a Creole sentence, that you should be doing this using formal English. And that for me is always a bit of a dichotomy for me, because I feel like it's dissonance in a sense to be telling students in Creole, this is how you have to be doing something, this is how you have to be writing something in standard English. And I see my colleague from the academic literacies program in St. Augustine with me putting up the my one and is mine's, and you're absolutely correct. So some students will say, if I say that this cup belongs to me, how do you translate that? Some students will say, that is my one. And other students will say, is mine's. Two different responses entirely. And you give them sentences as activities in class, one to warm up and one to get their brains functioning. You give them activities like that. And when they start coming up with the answers, that's when they begin to see how varied the language system is in Trinidad and Tobago, right? Because the response that you will get from a Tobagonian, whether it's from top side or country or whichever side, is a different response as well. And I also have to bear in mind that St. Augustine isn't only serving students from Trinidad and Tobago. St. Augustine also serves students from other parts of the region. So it always becomes a very, very, very interesting conversation. What I think I need to have better, I guess, teaching tips for, or better coping mechanisms for when I'm teaching the students, is ways to get them to self-check and see when they have switched from one language to the next language. That's the thing that I feel I've not given them enough coping skills for. How do you begin to identify when you've made the switch from one language to the other language, if in your head you are convinced that you are using the standard all of the time when you're not actually using the standard all of the time? And that's where I will, wrap up my little 2 cents about my writing, my teaching of my writing experiences in the foundation program. Thanks.
Thank you, Rhoda. Fascinating. And I see we have some hands raised. So we're going to go straight up to, I'm not sure if Andrew's hand is still up from before, right? Okay. To Rhoda, if you can take on your hand as well. So Vivine.
Yes, sorry.
Yes. Over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. And thanks very much, Rhoda. Interesting. You're speaking from a Trinidad and Tobago perspective, but
Yes.
a lot of what you said would apply right here in Jamaica, and I suspect in the other islands as well. One of the things I wanted to react to was when you expressed some kind of concern about the fact that you are using a type of Creole to teach English, and the kind of dichotomy that you think that creates. I thought to my days of being a foreign language teacher, and I was in fact using English to teach the students in the other language. So I don't know if it is just a political issue for you, why you think that there is such a problem with doing this, because you need to meet them where they are in order to take them where you want to take them. So that was one. The other thing is, I think I forgot my other point.
I think for me, it's just a matter of me wondering whether I'm being a hypocrite. I think I'm just wondering whether I'm being a hypocrite by standing up and talking to the students.
Yeah,
right.
But there's a sense in which you want to connect with them and not exclude them. So I don't think you should be too hard on yourself.
Okay.
But you said, yes, I know what it is I wanted to comment on. You said that some of the students thought that they were already using the English. And I just wanted to share an anecdote. When I was teaching the remedial English course so many years ago, a student said to me one day, then all this time I thought I was speaking English. And I thought that is a travesty, because it means that all along, I mean, this was a big woman, wasn't a high schooler coming into university.
Mm-hmm.
And all her years, she had been using, I guess, some kind of mesolect, and nobody pointed out to her that that was in fact not English, and that she needed to learn the English as well, because we must never think it's one or the other. And when I pointed out to her the differences, she was in shock that she was deceiving herself all this time. And I think the onus on us as teachers of writing is to ensure that that travesty does not continue, but that we make it clear to the students they don't need to be ashamed, but they also need to be able to communicate in English, because that's the language of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again, Rhoda.
And that's what I try to reinforce. And it's why I insist on or make the effort to teach using, mesolectal English, a range of the Creole with them, because I want them to understand that this is how we all communicate all the time. This is our mother tongue. This is what we're using, but for the purposes of academia, because we need to also use a common language when we're writing assignments, writing essays, writing research papers, we have to then switch to this language. So the entire time, my focus is to get them to feel confident about the Creole, but also to feel confident about using standard for specific reasons.
Okay, Deidre, I'm gonna take the last comment from you for Rhoda. Go ahead.
Thank you, Carolyn. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I want to first comment on the anecdote from Vivian. It's not surprising that something like that happens, because for years upon years upon years, it has been established that the approach to teaching English at the lower levels is not one that takes students through, say, for example, using a English as a second language approach. And so there is this assumption that students are entering schools with English, and so they go through the entire pre-university level without that kind of language awareness, right? And to what Rhoda was saying, I don't think you should feel as if you are being a hypocrite. It has been established that one of the strategies that seem to work, especially at this level, is the language awareness and the kind of contrastive analysis, of the different codes, because it's through the students understanding that this, and it's going to be very difficult for you to equip them enough with all the skills they need to say, this is when I move from speaking Creole to or using Creole to using English, when you're trying to also take them through so many different things with writing. But I think that the approach that you're taking is a needed one, and if nothing else, it's a move in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Deidre. And I was struck as well, Rhoda, in terms of, where you are at, because of course, so what, Deidre just mentioned the whole thing about English as a mother tongue tradition, where we would just assume, in the past that people are coming in and they're speaking English. We're not there now. And yet, even in our individual identities, not all of us are as comfortable using Creole and English, where you're able to say, I use Creole, I use a mesolectal form of English, and then you're looking at formal, etc. So that whole facility that, people like ourselves have, or lack of facility, is also an issue in terms of what you're trying to do. I can tell you that oftentimes when I use Creole in the classroom, my students say, Miss, no bother, Miss, and they laugh. Because my attempt at Creole is so different, it is so English, it is up there. And that's when I have to confront my own identity, and say, okay, and then how do I, as someone who, just to have a full class in just Creole would be a big challenge for me,
Right.
And so, yeah. Very interesting. I think, Janique, you have your hand up. That's the last comment for Rhoda. Janique, go ahead.
Hi everyone. Greetings again.
Morning.
It's a response to Rhoda, but it's also a response to the first presenter. Unfortunately, the name up is iPhones. I don't have the name.
Dominic.
Dominic. Right. So big up all the educators in the house, Vivian, Inez, Rhodes, who I've worked with in the past. I think that there's something to be said about Curaçao and Papamiento, Rhoda, where they have it now as the official language of education. So once upon a time, that was the Creole and that was sidelined. And then there was enough brouhaha by the specialists, which would be us in the room, to argue that they were disadvantaging their students because they were unable to participate completely because of the demands of speaking in quote unquote standard English. Well, in their case, it would have been Dutch. So that there's a precedent already set for doing that. Across our courses in academic literacy, there's at least one slide in the orientation, as Rhoda referenced, that speaks to the language continuum, the validity of both languages, and the advantages of being able to manipulate that spectrum dependent upon context. Yeah, and I often, as I am doing now, dance along that continuum myself and attempt to consistently remind, as you were saying that Dr. Deitch, remind students about their own level of mastery and encourage them to enhance their level of mastery across the spectrum. Knowing place and time becomes extremely important. When to do what and in what scenario. Yeah. I think the conversation kind of started earlier with what do we do in this context and how do we enhance what we're doing, trying to get students to operate at an optimum level in quote unquote standard English, especially in their writing. There was one phenomenon that has occurred to me that I haven't heard anyone else speak of, so I will bring it up. As a female teaching males, I teach of course all, but when the males are in the class, one of two things occur. In an attempt to impress, I don't know if you're still with me, in an attempt to impress, you will get those who, yeah man, they come in aggressive, they come in strong, they're talking a lot, and they're talking Creole. Yeah, miss, but hear why I'm saying, right? Why I say this? If you watch the scene, in order to ascertain their masculinity in the room. And in that scenario, what I do is I ask them, so what you're trying to say is, and I rephrase it. Very politely, I rephrase it. And I would, by my tone, kind of adapt their tone to the classroom, thereby reducing the masculinity just a touch. And the other option that occurs is you'll get those who would impress with their mastery of English. So you have the males who are excellent and articulate in English language, and they would speak up a lot in order to prove their worth in the room. And of course, the question is, in addition to what I'm doing about the aggressiveness, which is inaccurately assigned as a masculine trait, and mediating that, how do we then encourage what these who are skilled in standard English do to those who seem to be less so? You know what I'm saying? The question to me is, okay, we have them. We have males who are quite articulate in standard English, and they can, and they do express. In my classes, I have experienced it. Almost every semester, I get one or two. Remember, we don't have a lot of males. That's another fact we have to recognize. The percentage, the ratio of male females is drastic, right? But then how do we encourage? Do we flatter? Do we compliment? Do we applaud when we hear it, so that it encourages those who are more prone to use the Creole, to use the standard English in this context. You're feeling me? That's the question I'm asking. How do we get them? How do we get them to use it? And I would say, yeah, that was a beautiful piece of Creole. Nice. I wonder if you could say that in English.
Well, but I also want to throw in here, Janika, that sometimes they're using slang, not necessarily Creole. And it's important to get them to understand that they're using slang. And it's not, because it's very possible to be using the Creole and you're not using any slang at all. So I think the assertion of masculine dominance, because I know what you're talking about, it because I've experienced it in some of the courses where you're in faculties that have more males than females, as opposed to, so your classroom has more males than females as opposed to more females than males. Because when you're in classrooms that have a higher female to male ratio, the attitude towards the course is a different attitude. And then when you're in classrooms with higher male to female ratios, the attitude towards the course, of course, it has its own idiosyncrasies. And in situations like that, especially if the guys in the class are trying to attract the females in the class, there are all kinds of things that are playing out in terms of how they use language and how they answer questions when they're called upon to answer questions. And so it becomes very performative. Very, very, very performative.
Thank you. I think what's coming out here very strongly, though, is that the whole business of language and identity, the whole being mediated by gender, I mean, Dominic started it off with his presentation, and we see it coming also in terms of Rhoda, talking about classroom interaction with male students, etc. But there are one or two things that crossed my mind when I was listening to you. The first one was in terms of, obviously, there needs to, the politics of language and some of these underlying issues that we are seeing in terms of masculinities, etc. I mean, that can be brought foregrounded in the classroom. That can be brought up in terms of gender and language as part of something that students could even look at, and in terms of their own writing and reading, and then begin to interrogate how they, what they're doing in the classroom, so that they can even relate to some of that kind of, what has been said about it and how it might vary culturally and, our particular, history and our societies and the role of the males and the role of the females. But the other thing that I wanted to say also is that, we're talking about moving the students, validating their Creole, moving them to English, but a lot of some of the skills that we are developing, I think we have to come to a point where we have our academic literacy skills, and we also have English language proficiency, and we're not conflating them all of the time. The truth of the matter is that some of the things that they are learning, they can actually learn and perform it and show that they have competence in it in a bilingual form, both English and Creole. But without negating that, in fact, our goal is also to get proficiency in written English. The whole idea of bilingualism and introducing the writing in Creole in classrooms, certainly in Jamaica, is something that has taken on our life, especially with the New Testament having been translated into Jamaican Creole, and so we actually are having more and more of the public getting their minds around a written form of Creole using that system there. So of course it differs in all the territories, but one of the things that I think we need to be aware of is that oftentimes, as we have experienced now, where we have kind of taken little baby steps into saying, okay, in these low stakes assignments, you can, do it orally, and you can present it in Creole or in English or in whatever variety of language. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Rhoda. That dovetailed really nice with Dominic's own, as if you all planned it up, but I know you didn't.
Conspiracy. There was a whole conspiracy, Caroline, a whole conspiracy.
Yes, Deidre said agreed, and we have to be careful how we correct students when they use Creole. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. Going to hand it over now to Mark. Is Mark here?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
Mark,
here.
over to you. Just introduce yourself
Well,
first, Mark. Sorry, before
no
you start,
problem.
if anyone came in late and hasn't put their name and institutional affiliation in the chat, we just ask you to put it there so we have a record of who was here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your welcome. I'll share my screen. My name is. All right, sorry. Yes, my name is Mark McGowan, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Guyana. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I've been to previous events held, and I've always benefited a lot from the discussions. Today, I just want to give a very personal reflection and just showing you my thinking, my concerns, and highlighting some of what I hope to see happen, particularly in my context at UG. So I've been teaching these courses for a very long time, well, more than 10 years. And yet I still battle almost every year with a sense of uncertainty about really what's the purpose of the courses that I teach. And I know it's not something that I'm the only person facing, because very often when we have our meetings, the question comes up and there's always a laugh or a big discussion. And because of that uncertainty, I think periodically I've asked myself, am I doing, are these courses in particular doing more harm than good for students? And sometimes I feel, I feel, okay, I'm doing my best. And then I wonder, okay, but is my best good enough? And that brings me to some questions as I try to focus now a bit more on language and identity. And I've enjoyed where my colleagues have taken the discussion so far. And one of the aims that I have when I am in my classroom is I ask myself this question: how do I help my students find their voices? I think for me, as a writer, somewhat, I'm always saying voice is important. And I don't want to hear some generic something that mimics what they think is perfect or good. But I want to hear from you, even if it's not perfect as yet. Your vision, your thoughts, your journey, I just want to hear from you. And of course, that for this to be accomplished, there are several things that, several other questions that I regularly grapple with. And one of them, really, in recent times, has been assessments in our courses, coupled with the students' fixation with grades, and the impact this has on student learning and even the attitude to the courses. And I am more and more convinced that really these two things are perhaps hindrances to students finding their voices. So I've been thinking a lot recently about whether I should put in, there should be a move on grading in our system. Ungrading is a term that has been around for a while. I've noted two scholars there who have written quite extensively about the topic. But I am concerned that at the end of the course, students are just getting a grade without actually learning and enjoying the process and benefiting from the process. And I know ungrading can take on several forms, but I think one of the things that I am very much focused on and interested in is feedback that will help the student to grow. I know our systems are very much set up with a quantitative way of measuring progress, but I'm more pushing towards more qualitative feedback and qualitative assessments of students, with the intention that through this process, they'll be able to find their voices. And I'm not expecting to get perfect, whether it's in Creole or whether it's in English, over a 15, 30 week period. But at least something has been triggered and they are leaving the course more empowered than defeated. Because when they find their voices, I believe that you have really done a great thing in terms of shaping their identity, or helping to find their identity, and realize that they're not just passive individuals in the world, but they have the potential to bring change wherever they find themselves in life. So looking ahead, I really have two concerns. Well, I have many concerns, but these two I want to focus on really. How do we make our courses more student-centered, particularly as it relates to the content and assessment? Very often, I say my context, a lot of the decisions we make are driven by the lecturers and what would be best for us, rather than taking into consideration what would be best for the student. And this is not to downplay the challenges that we have. We have large numbers, we are understaffed, all these things. But at the end of the day, are we going to be lamenting, quote unquote, the quality for students, rather than looking at perhaps at maybe our own shortcomings in terms of what we expect of them and how we assess what we expect of them. I am also looking beyond that to the perception that for many students, and I've heard this in our discussion before, that this is just a course that they have to do, that they can complete their degree or the diploma, whatever they're doing. And so basically it's one that is just check, I'm done with that. But what about if we embrace it? This is me, and I don't even have the full answers as yet. But if they come to the table and we make it an experience for them, rather than just not a course that, okay, you can do that, and that, check, okay, next. Because at the end of the day, as we situate our discussions and our what we do and our practice, we are looking to shape critical thinkers, people who are willing to challenge the status quo. And if they don't have that, that belief, that encouragement, that insight, that shift in perception and perspective, I'm thinking maybe just in a generic operation, choosing graduates or people who just go through the system without having that that shift that we hope to achieve as academic literacy practitioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that really heartfelt, kind of expose in terms of how you are thinking about the courses and wrestling with the role that we are playing and, the impact that we are having and that we could have, reimagining it. Yes, I noticed Rhoda is saying that she's wrestling with the same thing. That whole idea of students, certainly because of the fact that our courses also are seen as service courses, that really, as you say, it's a compulsory thing. They didn't choose it. This wasn't their option. And so the whole business of achieving excellence in our course and really engaging fully with the courses is always, an issue. What always I remark on is that I know at UE, Mona, when you go to the graduation ceremonies, even though we are supposedly, these courses that everybody just does as, routine courses, the valedictorians always mention our courses. They mention it more in terms of how difficult and how challenging it is. Of course, the FD courses or whatever courses. So our courses do leave an imprint on them. The problem is it the kind of imprint that we want? What you say in terms of equipping them with the critical thinking and asking them to now, interrogate their realities and the status quo and all of that, So, there's so many constraints, as you say, the time that you mentioned, 15 to 30 weeks. You have some courses that are
13 to 15, but right now it's actually 13 weeks.
13 weeks. Yeah, very, you know, and the short periods of time to do that. How do we, could you say a little bit more about the ungrading? I don't know, I know you, there's a hand up, but before I go to Vivine, I'm not sure. I actually saw a very interesting and informative for me article on ungrading, and it was the first time I'd really read something like that I got from Charlene at your campus. So I don't know if it's one of the same, but could you just, you know, give us a, because we're so, I mean, how do you do anything without grading, you know?
Thank you. It's something generally, basically, it comes out of research that shows that grading does more harm than good to students, right? And that at the end of the day, when you get the A, B, C, D, really truly, what does it mean for them, especially those who get on the lower end of the spectrum, or it perhaps damages them in the long run, and it's a really hindrance to learning. And the concept of ungrading is that, okay, at the end of the day, you get a grade, right? Whether it's pass or fail, or even if you get a letter grade, right? But you are engaged in more formative feedback throughout the process. And you only grade that piece of work when it the students has imparted, has taken into consideration your feedback. One of the things that I think it's Connor says, he talks about the fact that students need a chance to fail before they are graded, right? Get a chance to learn and, okay, where am I going wrong? And that feedback, okay. But rather you give them a test and then, okay, one shot and you fail. And of course, you will go to make a comment here, but really, what point does it really make? What sense does it make for me that I've already failed? So at the end of the day, yes, you may get the grade depending on what you, how you go about it. But really, what you're trying to do in grading is to take away that focus on the letter grade and more about the process of learning. And at the end of the day, you assess the students based on their best efforts rather than the worst.
Okay.
That's me. That's in a nutshell.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I see two hands up. I'm going to go to Vivine first and then to Amma.
Thank you, Caroline. I was actually going to comment on something you said earlier before you referred to the ungrading, because a crazy idea came to me when you spoke about the fact that students don't want to do the courses because they're compulsory. I'm just wondering, and perhaps St. Augustine can speak to this, whether we could create different courses and they simply be told that they have to do a course and then they choose it, because nothing has changed really. It's still compulsory, but psychologically, I made this choice in the same way that in their major, they have to do, for example, an accounting course, but they have the choice of which one they do. I just wonder, and call me crazy if you wish.
To respond to that question means that if we were to opt to suggest something like that, then you have to go through the whole ACWAC Board of Undergraduate Studies. You have to get all of those permissions about the courses. And of course, you'd have to be looking at the fact that some of or many of
Sorry, can you speak a little louder? I'm not hearing you very clearly. I don't know if it's just me.
Sorry.
Yes, that's better.
I'm hearing you, Jenny.
Oh, sorry,
right.
Probably me. Okay.
Right. So all of the foundation courses in St. Augustine, I can't speak for the other campuses, but all of the foundation courses in St. Augustine are tailored and focused on specific degree options, right? Because the various departments or the various faculties would have sat down and decided in conjunction with us what skills they needed their students to have. And so the course for science students, science and technical writing, focuses on specific skills for those students. The course for law students and the courses for visual and performing arts students, those courses focus on writing skills that the students from those various faculties would need. And that's because members of the academic staff would have said, these are the things we need them to do. And then of course, the course has to pass through all of the various rigors that it has to pass through. So if we were to go with this suggestion being made there, and I don't want to make it sound as if I have an issue with this suggestion at all. I don't really have an issue with the suggestion that's being made per se. We'd have to consider that there are requirements that need to be met. So there'd be bureaucracy and red tape, et cetera, et cetera. I also wanted to say to Mark that ungrading is something that I have been looking at for quite some time, because there, as you pointed out, there's a lot that shows that the grade is a thing that students focus on, not so much the feedback. They look at the grade, and if it's a grade that they're not happy about, they don't pay attention to the feedback at all. And what I have found in my tutorials, which would be the smaller classes, because of course they're the larger lectures and then the tutorials, when you give them activities to do in the tutorial, and they come, because we use the flipped classroom approach, or certainly I've used the flipped classroom approach. So they come with the activity already prepared, and they put it up on the, they put it up in the, they share it so that everybody can take a look at it. And we're going through the assignment and we point out, you need to, you can fix this by doing this, you can improve this by doing that, this, that, and the other. You see over the course of the 10 to 12 weeks of tutorials, how they take on board the feedback and start to improve their writing. So their topic sentences become far more improved, their thesis statements become far more improved. You see little changes taking place as a result of the feedback. And I have noticed with some students, it's not like a scientific thing that I would have done, where you give them the assignment with all of the feedback on it, but once they see the grade, they're not looking at the feedback at all. And then when they come to you for a consult and you start going through the assignment, that's when they begin to realize, oh, that's why I got the grade that I got. But I know that the grade was the thing that shut down their brain. They weren't interested in looking at the feedback after that at all. So yeah, that's my 2 cents there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Janique. Was that Rhoda a while ago? Yes. Amma, and then Charlene. Amma, are you there?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, my mic has been giving a little problem. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. All right. Now, on the Mona campus, we have done some reconfiguring and restructuring, and our courses are tailored to the to meet the needs, as I think was mentioned by the previous speaker, the needs of the students in their core areas of study. So we have the course for the science students, we have for the social students, and so on. And I have found that this has helped to create a more positive image of the course, of the courses. And that has been coming out. I hope some of my Mona colleagues can back me up on this. I have noticed, let us say within the last maybe 3 or so years, that there has been a more positive attitude to the courses. Students are not, I'm not saying that we are anywhere near to where we would like to be, but there is definitely a shift I have noticed a shift in the perception of students about our courses. There is a greater appreciation. They are acknowledging that the skills that we're teaching or trying to develop in the academic literacies courses are definitely helping them. And it used to be that they would acknowledge this long after they had finished the courses. But I find that there is a greater acknowledgement of this, of the value of the courses. And we're getting these responses in our staff-student liaison meetings and also in our evaluations. There is a definite shift. So I think that we're on the right track, and I'm very hopeful that as time goes on, students will see the full value of the courses we are doing.
Thank you, Amma. Charlene?
All right, I want to establish first the assumption that I'm working with. I'm working with the assumption that we're moving towards a unified curriculum. And I'm also working with the assumption that the current efforts at the CARI community, what you call the term, the free movement of skilled persons and so on, and that whole process is failing hopelessly, and we don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. And I am now seeing us. I've seen us for a whole long time like this. And to steal Rhoda's term, auto-ethnography, if I can do a little auto-ethnographic statement here, I became so disillusioned and debilitated teaching these courses that I haven't been able to break away because my contract depends on it, and therefore my salary. But I created the Guyanese languages unit to save my own sanity. And it has to a certain extent, but I'm still tied to these courses. Now I'm thinking of Mark's last statement about meaningfulness. And one year what I did was take my students off into an Amerindian community. And the results I got were so unexpected that I realized there's something going on here that can probably be used as a little germ from which we can probably go off in a direction across the Caribbean. One boy whose mother was afraid to send him in the first place, so much so that she didn't tell me, she told another colleague. And when he came back, the colleague said to me, the mother called, and I'll tell you the honest truth, she didn't want to send him. She didn't know what on earth my trip into a village had to do with the English course. The child was transformed. He started to behave better at home, do his chores, make his bed in the morning. When we were there in the village, it was clear that some of the children thought a weekend was too short. And the show of the village was showing us a whole heap of things that he was hoping that UG students could help him with, right? And I'm thinking of the first presentation that really moved me. The others did too, but I'm riveted at the connection between the alienation of the male and the crime in our streets. And I'm thinking, how could we become that force as academic literacies practitioners to take in that whole cohort into university across the Caribbean and transform their consciousness about identities as Caribbean people, as people emerging out of slavery to stand up and the indentureship and indigenous genocide. How could we do that? And to my mind, what we're doing now is grossly inadequate. And I'm saying that very carelessly because I don't know what people are doing in their classrooms. But I would like to see a more collective effort across the Caribbean in these, what kind of quote unquote hazing in a very positive way can we do when we bring this cohort in, these young adults who are like firepower, they're ready for anything. What can we do? That's my point, my little 2 cents.
Thank you, Charlene, delivered with the usual passion. And thank you for that. Yeah, it is, at the end of the day, what really are we aiming at? Are we aiming at the kind of growth and self-actualization of these students, or are we really just thinking of it as something very utilitarian and not engaging, Caribbean young people and their abilities and the needs in the Caribbean in terms of these young people. I suppose people will look and say it's just a course, but from what I'm hearing and from my own experience, it's language and what we're doing with them. Language is everything. It's the being of the students, and it's an entire being that we're really engaging with. I suppose the other disciplines would say that as well. Janique, I see your hand up. Or was that one before? Janique?
No, that's a new hat.
Okay, go with it to Janique. Yes.
I wanted to say, I think two things. One, I don't have that that conscience grappling that Mark does. I get a lot of students, especially towards the end of the course, saying, nah, they really understand how useful it is. And that's probably tied to my educational philosophy, because my educational philosophy is based on the concept of making it real. So every single thing we teach, I try to align it with how they can use it in their real lives, like in their professional lives, or even in their personal lives. So they're seeing every session, the applicability to advancing their own scenarios. That's one thing. The other point was about us in St. Augustine, making the courses optional, and Rhodes explained quite a lot regarding the faculty specific content skills of each of these courses. But there's also the issue to consider with qualifications. So that there are those who would have to do either one or the other, dependent on what they're coming in with. So for example, if they're coming with CAPE, this is not, yeah? Because that means that we're dealing with different levels of writers. So that would also impact on what courses they can choose to do or they're allowed to do. There is one scenario, roles are not exactly clear, but there is a scenario where some students have choice within the humanities because they have two. So there's one that's compulsory based on their qualifications, and then they can choose out of maybe 2 or 3 courses for their second academic literacy course. And often they go where we would have suggested they go anyway. So for example, those in film can choose between writing about literature and the DCFA, the faculty, the Department of Creative and Festival Arts, their course, right? And they would more often than not, as in like 90-something% of the time, select the Creative and Festival Arts course for only level 7, as opposed to the writing in literature, which could be useful for them, which is why it's an option. But we would suggest, because they're in film, that they work in the arts. So even when they do have a choice, they tend to choose what's aligned with their, what's most closely aligned with their degrees, their majors, so that they can in turn utilize those skills across their other courses. All right.
Yes, thank you, Janique. I think this exchange of views in terms of the worth and the value of the courses is something that we need to continue. Center staging it perhaps in some kind of forum. The whole variable of communication across the curriculum, where some of the courses are aligned with faculties, and whether that impacts the perception of the students of the value of the course, how closely it aligns, etc., is something that would need to be considered. But definitely, I think Catalp needs to look at this whole business of how we ourselves feel about what the courses are achieving, if they are, why they are, and if they're not, why not. So, but we're going to move on to our last person who we actually put on the spot to say something, because I want to also get some sharing from other persons as well. So Andrew is the last of our, let's put it, invited persons, and I'm gonna hand it over to him.
Hi, good morning, everybody. You can hear me?
Yes.
I'm glad you said put on the spot. I feel slightly like an interloper because I'm not currently teaching the academic literacy course at my university. I haven't taught it for 2 years. But I do think that the questions and the discussion we've been having obviously transcend just these specific courses. And I had initially, actually, I thought this was a public event first. So I was prepping a presentation for it until Charlene told me this morning that it was a closed group. So I've kind of amended what I have. Yeah, so sure. I'll talk a little, or particularly introspectively looking at myself. I think I have a few slides that I might bring up. So what I wanted to, but I'll show some of my slides that I think it kind of helps in giving a sense of where my mind is when I got the stimulus for the presentation. I mean, it was quite open, and I found myself thinking, oh, this is really wide. Like, for example, the first thing I was thinking about was my post-colonial literature class that I teach, and how often we talk about things like identity and language and Caribbean identity, you know, the Stuart Halls, for example, and that kind of stuff. But the name I gave this presentation, and it's really not a presentation, it's just like some vignettes I thought about, was that I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think, I know I've been hearing my colleagues speak quite well on this. You know, how do our students kind of integrate their language with identity? But for me, something that I think is really important is beyond or before even moving to our students, what does language and identity mean for us as practitioners? And where do we place ourselves in our pedagogy or within our classrooms? And I've been wrestling a lot with that question since I began working at the university 5 years ago, because I think that there's always this kind of gap or boundary between who am I as an academic leading or assisting students in finding their own perspective. And I was glad when Rhoda kind of was talking about, you know, the bureaucracy of getting those courses passed and what it means, because I think a lot about the ways that our academic systems are so kind of overwhelmed with bureaucracy. And very often what that means is that we as people with, you know, identifiable traits and differences and ideas are very often kind of swallowed up whole by the systems we're working in. And I think this becomes particularly concerning in fields like ours that touch on things like language and identity and humanity, because for us to divorce ourselves from what we do, you know, for many of us, for example, we're working on courses with multiple lecturers. So how do we navigate, you know, our own personal relationship with what we're teaching with the larger sense of what we are compelled to do or what we are supposed to be doing? How do we find a place to express what we want in our pedagogy to our students without feeling that we're being hypocritical or that we're being false to ourselves, while navigating and managing what we might need to do for our students? And I was thinking about a presentation I did last year at a conference on Andrew Salke, and I extracted this Salke quote from it, because something I think is always important when I am working in my approaches to teaching, whether it's my literature courses last academic year, for example. I don't teach the use of English course currently that we have at the University of Guyana, but I was working on a similar course with the law students, because presently at the University of Guyana, we don't have the system where each field may have their own course. And I actually think that might be something we might explore, because I do think that the one-size-fits-all way that we have had to work on that course has affected perceptions of it. And so, for example, the only undergrad students who do not do this course are law students who have a course designed for them, and students who are pursuing a degree in literature. They have a course in advanced writing. And I have found very often, especially in the law students, there's this perception that the course they're doing is better than the other course, because that course is, you know, for them alone, rather than the other students in the majors who have to do the course, regardless if you're doing sociology or health science or agriculture or whatnot. But when I was teaching the law course last year, for the first time, I was doing it because there was a gap that needed to be filled really urgently. Like, it was like a 1 week time for prepping for the beginning of the semester. And I found myself spending a lot of time talking about stuff that wasn't initially on the course syllabus that I felt was important. So for example, I had my students write some critical responses to some essays. I gave them an extract from To Make a Kincaid's A Small Place. I gave them an extract from Language as a Colonizer from So I gave them a piece from Arundhati Roy. And I asked them to read the essays and just, you know, answer some questions on things like style and purpose and writing. And I found it really interesting the way these students who are in the law degree, because there's a perception in Ghana that the law students are so smarter than everybody else. And I found it really interesting how these students that were so confident in their intelligence couldn't pick up on so many things that were central to like West Indian or global South histories. Like not picking up, for example, on Kincaid's, you know, ironic approach to tourism, or not picking up on why when Arnold Roy was writing about the pandemic, she was talking about things like class and ethnicity and gender. And I found myself spending more time than I planned talking about aspects of history, which is how the Salty Code came into it. Because we cannot, of course, no matter how we may, for example, use perspectives from the wider world, we are in this regional space of Caribbean people. And it comes with certain demands, certain expectations, but also certain things we have to grapple with. And the historical context of the Caribbean is so essential to the work that we do, even if you don't always think about it. And I found that for the students that I teach in my major, which is in English, they have their classes in post-colonial writing, that they have to have that kind of learning. But for students who are doing a degree in agriculture or science or whatever degree that's not in the humanities, they have jarringly little perspective of how the historical context of this region affects the way that we operate now. And I am always so alarmed by it because it sets up a very kind of imbalanced perspective moving ahead. We cannot begin to really grapple with any kind of question about how students are able to navigate language use if they are so ignorant of how language works as a historical, sociological, philosophical concept. And this is not just students. These are also colleagues. There are people in other faculties. There are people in the admin universities who have the same kind of perception of trying to divorce historical context from contemporary practice. And so when I was teaching that law course, a language argument course to the students, and I spent some time looking at this, I kind of found myself even reevaluating the way that our universities are kind of structured and the way that in, divorcing the below the iceberg stuff from just the tip, which we work on with these students for 4 years, but really for 1 semester in these courses, we are kind of bound by the bureaucracy in ways that end up stressing us out, but also we find ourselves being aware, like Mark was mentioning, like there are things that we know that the students might need, but there is no framework that allows us that possibility. And of course, that becomes frustrating, it becomes enervating, and then it becomes a case where you have this very ambivalent relationship with the work that you're doing. And no one can really thrive in that kind of environment. I know they always say, comfort makes us complacent. And I always say that it's not true. I say, if you're a gardener and you have garden, you don't, throw gravel on your plants, you treat them tenderly and gently because that is how they're able to grow. But the approach that we have been kind of compelled to use is one where, everything is at expediency. And I'm sure it's the same at my sister colleagues in the Caribbean. Expediency trumps creativity, it trumps anything else. The work needs to get done. The papers need to be marked. The students need to be getting certain things, even if it might, cause some cognitive dissonance. And I was thinking about, and like I said, I will be talking about literature because that is really the field that I teach mostly, but I do think it's relevant here. I was thinking about Derek Walker's play pantomime because I tend to mention it a lot when I'm teaching students about language. And I think that what happens, even for persons who I think are a lot more thoughtful about the number of languages in the region, I think that there is still this kind of antagonistic relationship between English and our Creole languages that is very unhelpful. And like when I was mentioning my response to the question of, the feminization or the perceived feminization of English, I think a lot about when we are teaching language. Well, let's remove English from the equation for now. It was this Twitter thread I saw a few weeks ago from a Japanese language teacher talking about many people want to learn Japanese these days because it's a language that's in vogue. And he always has to stop them from their enthusiasm and ask them, why do you want to learn this language? Do you want to learn it so you can talk to family that's in Japan? Maybe you're a diaspora Japanese. You want to learn it because you want to watch, a Japanese movie? Do you want to learn it because you want to be able to talk to business colleagues? And he went on at length talking about how people's idea of what language use means can become so murky. And I have always tried in my little spaces when I'm talking with students to make them recognize that language is a tool beyond anything. I mean, language is also a reflection of identity, yes, but language primarily in spaces like ours, academic or professional, it is a tool. And I think emphasizing that tool-based purpose of language is important, because even if language is part of identity, which it is, that is also a tool. If language is part of identity, it's to express ourselves, right? As people, that is really the central thing of it. And what I find that really sort of plays into how I approach teaching, because I think like you, for example, I tend to speak more standard English than Creole, mostly because of how I grew up. Like I learned to read before I learned to speak. And of course I was reading books that were written in English. So it's always kind of been the language that I first was sort of like communicating in, because I didn't speak much until I was maybe much older. And so I have found myself grappling with that question of, oh, why am I not more proficient in Creole languages? And what does it mean that I'm not proficient in this language? And I'm going to get to a slide later on that kind of grapples with that. But then I think, for example, of George Lamming talking about the way that, English is a West Indian language, not in the way that it was created, but the way that we have been able to utilize it. And I come back to this particular section in, are you guys hearing, or is that just Janique's reception?
No, I'm hearing.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I don't know if everybody else see the picture of Janique, but
I think a lot about, I don't know if you're familiar with pantomime, but it's a two-person play that's sort of a riff or a response to Robinson Crusoe. And there's this white hotelier in the country. And of course, there's the Black servant Calypsonian who's the worker. And it's about, disrupting those dynamics. And I love that play a lot because it's about language. And what we find happening as the play goes on is that although Jackson, who's the Caribbean person, has competency in English, he intentionally muddies it up to make a point to his boss. And I tend to use this as an example with my students to let them understand that no language is sacrosanct and no language is beyond maneuvering. And I do it also to teach them what I think is my most important thing when I teach any class in language. Or writing. So like, for example, when I teach essay writing, we start, with the basics, which can be very restrictive, as we know. We don't write in the basics as academics anymore. But I try to tell my students that once you're able to recognize what the basics are, then you can start disrupting it. But you have to know what the base is before you start to play around with it. And it's the same with English. We're not learning English because you need to, usurp your identity. But if you're able to be competent in the English and in your Creole language, think of how better equipped you are to disrupt the colonial patriarchy that you're all living in. But we can't do it if we're not competent in what they initially thought was it, but we have now taken over. Because the thing about people and we're still living, in neo-imperialistic landscapes, and we're still seeing this kind of culturation happening from all parts of the world right now. A lot of those people are never going to condescend, as they might think of it, to learn our languages. And some of them might because they're trying to do extractive research. If we want to really work on what I think is the unified Caribbean dream of, negating these centuries of colonial scourge, we need to let our students understand it's not about learning this thing because you're letting them win. It's about learning this thing as a way of disrupting them. And I know, like, for example, I know the value in Agile art saying, you can't break down the battles with the master's tools. But I think language is a lot more complicated than that. Because at this point, and somebody mentioned it earlier, mentioning to the students that you're not learning this language to usurp your native tongue, but you're learning it so that you might use it in a particular form. And I do think it's important to sort of bring examples of Caribbean persons who have been able to utilize that previously problematic concept in a way that brings us to some kind of ability to, perform insurrection against them. But we can't do it if we don't know it. And if we don't give our students that kind of historical context to why it's valuable, then we are, I don't want to say we're failing them. We are, but we're not the only one responsible. It's a larger structural thing we're working in that, of course, every day, I'm sure we all kind of deal with that stress. And I wanted to bring up a stanza from this poem that I teach in one of my final year post-colonial class from Indian writer Sujata Bhatt. And she opened the stanza talking about her own grappling with English, which of course we know English went to India in the same way it came to our parts of the world through, genocide and colonization. And most of her writing is in English, and she has often spoken about, the difficulties of grappling with that, but then kind of giving herself the space to not, spend her time trying to worry about why she's speaking the language, because every language has been used in some kind of problematic way, even our languages. We have leaders who speak really that are terrible to us. So it's not the case of a language on its own having some kind of inherent goodness or badness. Language is just what you use it. And the more tools you have available, the more effective you are at fighting whatever fight you want to fight. And I think that we spend so much time kind of, hand-wringing about, our own moralistic relationship with how we speak, rather than thinking it's not, language doesn't work like that. It's not a person, although it's living, breathing, and changing. And we ourselves need to think about how we engage with it so that we are at a place of peace or confidence in what we're doing before we begin to engage with the students. I wanted to close with something on language, but slightly askew, because it was one of the things that I had when I thought of this presentation that was interesting. Because I think of language not just in terms of English or Creolese, but language in terms of how we deal with concepts. And I wanted to talk a bit about concepts of queerness and another kind of non-heteronormative identities in the region. And I want to give this anecdote because it's still, I think about something that happened when I taught Frantz Fanon to my students a few years ago, and it sort of affected how I have engaged with students in terms of speaking about myself or trying to be open with them. And I did a paper actually in 2019 talking about Fanon's influence in the Caribbean, but also talking about Fanon's homophobia, which is kind of a touchy subject because Fanon is, of course, as we know, one of the great thinkers in our region. And I remember teaching this extract from Black Skin, White Maths, and I did it when I was a student because I also went to this university I'm currently teaching at. And I remember when I taught it, the topic, that word homophobia never came up in our discussion. We just did the text, we analyzed why it was important, we moved on from it. But I taught this text to a class of all women. There were about 12 of them. And we were talking about the way that for Fanon, he argued that people in the Caribbean are not inherently homosexual. That is something that we learn from Western cultures, and it's sort of like something we do to sort of keep ourselves alive, essentially. And while I was teaching that class, one of my students came out to me in the class. And she told me as we were talking that this is the first time she'd actually come out to anyone. And I remember, I mean, I'm much older now, and I think I can look back with different eyes, but I didn't know what to do in that moment because I found myself thinking, I'm happy to trust this classroom as a space to be honest about that. But I also found myself thinking of my responsibilities as an academic to think about how I talk to my students about things. Now, luckily, I'm not going to be going into a classroom just, talking homophobic or, sexist rhetoric because I'm very much kind of entrenched in that kind of dialectic in my pedagogy. But I've heard lecturers do it. And I've heard students tell me what lecturers would do it. And I think, and very often in courses like these where we write essays, like I've seen, for example, heard or sometimes seen colleagues, we might be doing an essay on something like racism or gender or sexuality. And very often we end up being complicit in harm, the way that we allow people's identities to become a subject of argument in a classroom. And I understand that classes like this sometimes talking about the society is essential, but we don't train the students on best practices to talk about identities. We don't even really focus on that because we gotta teach them to write the essay. So we don't spend time thinking about the sociological dynamics or the humanistic dynamics. We just say, okay, write an essay on whether transgender people should have rights, or whether this group should whatever. And we don't know all of our students, what they're going through. We don't know what their identities are. So when my student came out to me, I thought to myself, it had never even crossed my mind to think about my students as people beyond students. They were just people in my classroom. I wasn't thinking about what they were feeling. And I think very often this kind of bureaucratic framework to the way that we approach teaching means that we don't see the people to be teachers people. And very often, accidentally, we might bring up a topic that a student identifies with. And because we are not thoughtful in how we think about it and talk about it, and we don't guide our students on the same thing, we end up repurposing some of that harm because we're thinking really about teaching a course like this is structural. How do they learn paragraph writing? How do they learn syntax or diction? And language is about much more than words. You can have all the words, but you may be terrible at language. And I really wanted to include this anecdote just as sort of a jumping off point and thinking about the need for us to add an important element of humanistic learning to any kind of course, whether it's like this or any other course. Because we do not know who is in our classroom. We do not know where they're coming from. And I think that when we work, sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose, with this kind of heteronormative patriarchal approach to language. So like we think of things like queerness or things like femininity or things like radicalism as fringe topics. So very often these fringe topics become the main subject of essays. So students are spending 3 weeks working on an essay on a topic that might be a student we are teaching, their identity. And we never discuss it. We don't spend time thinking about the implications of that. And we just kind of, get by with our work. And so I have found myself trying to, I don't have an answer for it. It's a hard question to really grapple with. But I do think it's important for us to add that element. And if we are struggling because of bureaucracy, we need to make some noise and let those bureaucrats understand that the approach to working with language is shifting every day. And we're the ones with the authority. They're not the authorities on this subject. So surely we are best equipped to let them understand that perhaps some of their, punitive approaches to how they want us to do these courses might not really always be tenable. I'm going to stop there. I've been talking a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Boy, you have given us a lot to think about with that presentation. And I suppose, using a theme like language and identity, with identity encompassing so much, in terms of who we are as human beings, that whole aspect of us keeping that in the forefront of our minds when we teach these courses is something we need to be reminded of, because really we do think of them as skills courses and proficiency courses, and not think of the whole business of language as being, the representation of who we are as human beings and reflection, etc. So, that whole idea of, what are the kind of core concepts that we engage with. Dominic started off by talking about toxic masculinity, and Andrew has kind of ended bringing it back to questions of identity in terms of sexuality and sexual orientation. And I guess it must give us, when we pick topics that we want students to write on, I guess it puts the onus on us to be very thoughtful about what that really means to our students who have their own identities to engage with these topics. That's something that's quite deep in a way. Yes, I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment or ask Andrew any questions. I know we are at 12:15 now, so, but we still have a little bit of time. I said we go to 12:30. I wanted to say something, not so much to Andrew, but to go back to something Mark had said when he was talking about whether the courses do more harm than good and how valuable the courses were. And he mentioned the whole issue of feedback, and oftentimes, of actually using grading based on response to feedback. And I want to link that a little bit with what Andrew just mentioned in terms of our, you know, the kind of regimented way in which we have to function in the academy with grading and meeting, you know, jumping through the hoops and the bureaucracy, etc., and the stress that is put on us. And to say that oftentimes, you know, most of our courses will have adopted a process writing, or what we call a process writing approach, but I know oftentimes as a marker, and I will give students feedback, and the next draft that comes, oftentimes I'm not even looking back at the feedback necessarily. If I'm engaging with a student in our oral one-on-one consultation, maybe, but sometimes they're just picking up that next draft and marking it, and as you say, assigning it a grade, rather than, you know, look at what were the particular element, how did that person now make the changes, which of course is more time consuming in a context where we have these large numbers of students and little time. So I really, you know, was just thinking that in a sense, that whole concept of rethinking our grading practices and some of those core practices is something that we need to attend to. Okay. Well, I am not, yes, Charlene. Charlene?
And Caroline, I'm aware that we only have a little time, but I wanted to say that we really have to continue this conversation. We must come back and maybe we can bring more people. And we must big up the autobiographical element of it a little bit more. And when I say big it up, I mean expand it.
Expand
Not
it,
in the
yeah.
sense to big it up. To add something from my own autobiography is that, you know, when I took my little 4-year-old child to Jamaica, strange twist of fate, I ended up in Jamaica as a result of an accident. So she was brought up by a Jamaican community. I'm a single mother, and she stopped speaking English in 2 months. And there is no way I was going to turn to my little child and say, don't bother with a language. That child spoke no other language but Jamaican Creole until she started high school at Montego Bay. And because I was speaking to her in English, because as you rightly said, Caroline, when I try to speak Jamaican to my students in Jamaica, it's a miss no matter. Miss, you can't manage, no matter. Right? And Andrew can relate to that. I mean, when I was a little girl starting what we call Big ABC in Guyana, a very Black child came up to me and said, "You think you're white, no? You think you're white? Well, let me tell you something. You ain't white just because you're dark, so you're a Portuguese." Now, that statement tells you the whole history of Guyana. Whiteness was associated with English, Creole was associated with Africanness, and the white-skinned Portuguese were not equated with whiteness because they came similarly to the indentured and the African. So there was them was we, and them the start Creole even more deep than we, right? So in terms of the teaching in this course to keep my salary, I felt that I was damaging myself by trying to present the legitimacy of a course that was saying to students term after term, year after year, to be a good academic, you have to excel in English. I'm sorry, I totally don't believe it. If you have Carolyn Cooper standing up to give her presentation to receive her professorship in Jamaican Creole, how dare we tell any student that they can't do the same thing? That's what troubles me about what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Amen for now.
Yes, thank you, Charlene. Janique?
Wow, the end of that that statement there, Charlene, it just hit me for 6, as they say. That is what I was coming to say, which I guess aligns with the last statement Charlene was making, is that there's so much that has come out from these interactions, from these presentations today, that I am not even sure. I think Charlene started off by saying we need to do this again. I have no idea how you all are going to organize it, but there are so many themes, so many issues, so many ideas that have been brought out that we should flesh out as the quote unquote specialists in the field. I think priorities for me would be the concept of drafting and draft marking as it contributes to excellence in writing. There is, of course, the whiteboard Charlene just threw in about Creole as a not even standard as a requirement to graduate, and the place of Creole in that. There's a concept of identity and language, our identity with language, and the students' identities with language. There's the issue, which I think was the last time I was at a Catalp's meeting, we were talking about specialists in other fields and their perceptions of language and writing and how that impacts on our students, and where our students value or devalue or perform or do not perform in our courses because of the way they're quote unquote area specialist lecturers discuss and interact with language. And these are some core ideas that I think would demand individual sessions.
Yes.
To flesh out and see if we as a quote unquote unit can come to consensus, because if we can't, who can?
Right.
Come to some kind of consensus, and as a result, develop action-oriented plan.
Yes.
What do we do?
Thank you for that, Janique. Definitely, as I said, it has been very rich. Lots of different strands, lots of different areas that we need to engage with, and we definitely have to kind of mine it and try and follow up with more focused sessions. But apart from that, there are lots more stories to share, in terms of our community, etc. And so it might actually be good also to have a similar session where we open it up to more people just to speak about the whole issue of language and identity and their personal, professional, and programmatic stories, so that we, really get a sense, because of course we have gotten a great sense of three different territories, coming from 3 different territories, 4 different speakers, and our sharing in the feedback as well has opened up different perspectives. But I know there's much more. That we had about 25 people on the chat, and so there are many people who haven't had a chance to really say anything, and of course we didn't have time for everyone. But yes, I think that the telling of our stories around language and identity will reinforce some of what has been brought to the surface here, but also even bring in more areas of needed focus. So okay, good. I think Dominic has mentioned the name of the documentary, Iceman by Ian Strawn there. Okay, colleagues, this has been, I think, really everything and more than we expected. I want to thank particularly those who were so willing to have taken the lead: Dominic, Rhoda, Mark, and Andrew. Really have given us a lot to think about, a lot of work for Catalp to do to build on this. What is a good thing is that we've recorded it, and we are trying to be out there. So we will contact you with your permission if you will allow us to put it on our YouTube channel or in our social media somewhere. We can edit you out if you want to, but we'll get back in touch with you to get some permission in terms of your presentation, because it really would be good for the wider community to be able to see, to participate, in a second-hand way, even in what was shared today. So, colleagues, is there anyone else who wants to add any famous last words? Okay, if not, yes, go ahead.
One thing,
yes,
one expression comes to mind that reverberates based on all of the discussion and the presentations, which is Audre Lorde's quote, "Can the master's tools dismantle the master's house?"
There you go. That's true. I wanted
just
to
want
actually
to say, Caroline,
yes.
good job. And, you know, I'm so glad I was able to come. Every time you have something, I have a class. And so I've not been able to join this year at all. And so I just made an effort today when I saw the thing. I said, I have to be here. And I'm very glad I came. Thank you so much.
Great, Beth. Good to have you. Good to have you. And we'll continue. I want to end with just a little clip, which really, you know, really came out. It was a TikTok that came out very recently. I don't even have to introduce it. It just says it all. I hope I can find it. All right, let me try and share the screen. Okay, we need to hold on. Let me see if I can find it. Let me share the screen. No, hold on. Oh, okay. I'm gonna have to end the recording. They say if I want to access it. I'm just gonna just end the recording.